In the aftermath of the Second World War, as Europe was divided into hostile blocs and the geopolitical map of the continent hardened along ideological lines, Finland found itself in a uniquely precarious position, sharing a long and exposed border with the Soviet Union while seeking to preserve its sovereignty, democratic institutions, and market economy, a challenge that would give rise to what later observers termed Finlandization, a strategy born not of capitulation, but of calculated restraint, shaped by historical memory, military reality, and the evolving structures of the Cold War. Finland's predicament was rooted in its wartime experience, having fought the Soviet Union twice between 1939 and 1944 in conflicts that ended not with occupation, but with territorial losses, reparations, and a sober recognition of asymmetrical power, outcomes that convinced Finnish leaders that survival in the post-war order required neither defiance nor submission, but a disciplined neutrality carefully calibrated to Soviet security concerns. The 1947 Paris Peace Treaty formalized Finland's post-war status, limiting its armed forces and confirming territorial concessions, while leaving its political system intact, a distinction that set Finland apart from the states that would soon fall under direct Soviet control in Eastern Europe. This fragile autonomy was further defined in 1948, with the signing of the Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance between Finland and the Soviet Union, a treaty that committed Finland to resist attacks by Germany or its allies through Finnish territory, and to consult Moscow on security matters, while conspicuously avoiding any obligation to align militarily with the Soviet bloc, a formulation that reflected Finland's determination to anchor its neutrality in legal commitments rather than ideological alignment. Under the leadership of Juho Kusti Paasikivi and later Urho Kekkonen, Finnish foreign policy was shaped by a pragmatic assessment of geography and power, emphasizing predictability, reliability, and the avoidance of provocation, principles that guided Helsinki's conduct throughout the Cold War and formed the core of what became known as the Paasikivi-Kekkonen line. This approach did not entail passive withdrawal from international affairs, but rather an active management of relations with both East and West, as Finland sought to reassure the Soviet Union of its non-hostile intentions while maintaining economic and cultural ties with Western Europe, a balancing act that required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. Domestically, this strategy imposed constraints on political discourse and media coverage, as overt anti-Soviet rhetoric was discouraged, and certain topics were treated with caution, not through formal censorship alone, but through a culture of self-restraint, informed by the perceived risks of antagonizing a powerful neighbor, a phenomenon that would later fuel debates about the costs of neutrality and the boundaries of democratic expression under geopolitical pressure. Militarily, Finland pursued a policy of credible self-defense without alliance commitments, maintaining a conscription-based force designed to signal that, while it would not threaten its neighbors, it was prepared to defend its territory against any violation, a posture intended to reinforce neutrality by making aggression costly, without implying alignment with either bloc. Economically, Finland integrated into Western markets while sustaining extensive bilateral trade with the Soviet Union, using clearing arrangements that provided stability and mutual benefit, and in doing so, it avoided the economic isolation that characterized many Eastern Bloc states, while also demonstrating to Moscow that Finnish prosperity was not a Trojan horse for political subversion. Internationally, Finland positioned itself as a mediator and bridge builder, hosting conferences and participating in multilateral institutions where its neutral status enhanced its credibility, a role exemplified by its later involvement in the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, but already foreshadowed in earlier efforts to project an image of responsible neutrality rather than ideological ambiguity. The success of this strategy was not guaranteed, and was periodically tested by crises that exposed the fragility of Finland's position, including moments when Soviet pressure intensified, and Finnish leaders were compelled to reaffirm their commitments in ways that sparked controversy at home and suspicion abroad. Yet each episode reinforced the central premise that survival depended on adaptation rather than confrontation. Western observers often misunderstood Finland's posture, interpreting its caution as weakness or accommodation, while Soviet leaders viewed it as a model of how a neighboring state could align its behavior with Soviet security interests without formal subordination, a dual perception that underscored the ambiguity inherent in Finlandization and the difficulty of sustaining neutrality in a polarized world. Nevertheless, Finland's experience during the early Cold War demonstrated that small states were not merely passive objects of superpower rivalry, but could exercise agency through strategic restraint, legal frameworks, and consistent signaling, crafting a space for autonomy within constraints that would have overwhelmed less disciplined polities. As the Cold War deepened and Europe's division became entrenched, Finland's path stood in contrast to the fate of its Baltic neighbors and to the rigid alignment of Eastern Europe, highlighting the contingent nature of Cold War outcomes and the role of leadership, timing, and historical context in shaping them. The foundations laid in the late 1940s and early 1950s would define Finland's trajectory for decades, establishing neutrality not as an absence of strategy, but as a deliberate and evolving response to the Soviet shadow that loomed over Northern Europe, and setting the stage for the debates, adaptations, and pressures that would characterize Finlandization throughout the Cold War. As the Cold War intensified in the 1950s, Finland's strategy of disciplined neutrality was repeatedly tested by shifts in the international environment that exposed the narrow margins within which Helsinki operated, and the consolidation of Urho Kekkonen as the dominant figure in Finnish politics marked a decisive phase in the management of this precarious balance, as Kekkonen combined personal diplomacy with institutional continuity to ensure that Finland's conduct remained predictable in Soviet eyes, while preserving room for maneuver at home and abroad. The Soviet Union's evolving security concerns, shaped by the militarization of the Cold War in Europe and the integration of Western Europe into NATO, heightened Moscow's sensitivity to developments along its northwestern frontier, and Finland's leaders understood that any perception of drift toward the Western Bloc could trigger pressure or intervention, a risk underscored by the fate of other small states whose neutrality had proven fragile under superpower scrutiny. Within this environment, Finland's foreign policy emphasized consistency above all else, avoiding abrupt shifts and signaling reliability through adherence to treaties, careful rhetoric, and a refusal to participate in military alliances, even as it quietly expanded economic and cultural links with Western Europe. The 1955 admission of Finland to the United Nations, coinciding with the dissolution of the Allied Control Commission and the return of the Porkala naval base from Soviet lease to Finnish control, appeared to validate this approach, reinforcing the perception that neutrality, if credibly maintained, could yield tangible benefits and enhance sovereignty rather than erode it. Domestically, however, the demands of neutrality generated tensions as political actors navigated the line between democratic pluralism and the constraints imposed by proximity to Soviet power, with debates over foreign policy often subordinated to a consensus that stability and predictability were paramount. a consensus that marginalized more confrontational voices and fostered a political culture in which self-censorship was normalized as a form of prudence rather than repression. This culture extended into the media and academia, where discussions of Soviet policy and history were often framed cautiously, reflecting an awareness that public discourse could have external repercussions. And while these constraints did not extinguish democratic institutions, they shaped their operation in subtle but pervasive ways. The international crises of the late 1950s and early 1960s further illuminated the pressures inherent in Finlandization, as periods of heightened East-West tension narrowed the space for neutrality and forced Finnish leaders to engage in active reassurance of Soviet intentions, a process that relied heavily on personal diplomacy and informal communication to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into demands for alignment. These efforts underscored the degree to which Finland's autonomy depended not only on formal treaties, but on the credibility of its leadership and the continuity of its signaling, a reliance that exposed vulnerabilities, but also demonstrated the agency exercised by a small state operating under constraint. Western reactions to Finland's posture remained ambivalent, as policymakers and commentators alternately praised Helsinki's ability to preserve independence and criticized what they perceived as excessive accommodation. A debate that reflected broader uncertainties about the viability of neutrality in a bipolar world and about the moral boundaries of compromise under pressure. For the Soviet Union, Finland's conduct was closely scrutinized as both a potential security risk and a potential model. And while Moscow occasionally exerted pressure through diplomatic channels or public statements, it generally refrained from overt coercion so long as Finland's behavior remained within accepted parameters, reinforcing the logic that restraint could be reciprocated. This reciprocal dynamic did not imply equality, but rather a tacit understanding shaped by asymmetry, in which Finland acknowledged Soviet primacy in security matters, while the Soviet Union tolerated Finnish domestic autonomy and Western economic integration. Economically, the 1950s and 1960s saw Finland deepen its participation in Western markets while maintaining extensive bilateral trade with the Soviet Union, a dual orientation that reduced dependency on any single partner and provided a buffer against external shocks, even as it required careful management to avoid politicization. This economic strategy complemented Finland's diplomatic posture by demonstrating that neutrality was compatible with prosperity and integration, countering narratives that framed alignment as a prerequisite for development. Militarily, Finland continued to invest in territorial defense and conscription, reinforcing the credibility of its neutral stance by signaling that it would resist any violation of its sovereignty regardless of the source, a posture designed to deter opportunism without provoking suspicion. The credibility of this defense policy rested not on alliance guarantees, but on the expectation that resistance would raise the costs of intervention and complicate escalation, an expectation rooted in Finland's wartime experience and communicated consistently to both East and West. As the Cold War matured, Finland's approach illustrated the complex interplay between constraint and choice that defined the experience of small states in a polarized system, revealing that neutrality was not a static condition, but a continuous process of adjustment, requiring vigilance, discipline, and political cohesion. The very term Finlandization, which began to circulate in Western discourse during this period, captured both admiration and unease, encapsulating the paradox of a state that remained formally sovereign yet visibly constrained, and sparking debates that often obscured the intentionality and strategic calculation underpinning Finnish policy. Within Finland itself, these debates were largely muted by a political culture that prioritized consensus and continuity, reflecting a collective assessment that the risks of open confrontation outweighed the costs of restraint. By the mid-1960s, Finland had established itself as a stable, prosperous, and internationally respected neutral state. Yet this stability rested on a delicate equilibrium that required constant maintenance and whose durability would be tested by future crises, demonstrating that survival under the Soviet shadow was not the product of weakness, but of sustained strategic discipline applied over decades. As the Cold War progressed into the late 1960s and early 1970s, Finlandization entered a more mature and contested phase, one in which the strategy's external success sharpened internal debates about its democratic cost and strategic sustainability, even as Finland's international standing as a neutral actor appeared to strengthen. And this tension was most evident during moments when Soviet pressure surfaced overtly, testing whether neutrality rested on mutual restraint or on Finland's willingness to anticipate and accommodate Moscow's preferences. The most revealing of these moments occurred in 1961, during the so-called Note Crisis, when the Soviet Union invoked the consultation clauses of the 1948 treaty in response to rising tensions in Europe, prompting fears that Finland might be drawn into bloc politics or coerced into security arrangements that would compromise its autonomy. And although the crisis was ultimately diffused through diplomatic engagement and the postponement of consultations, it underscored the fragility of Finland's position and the degree to which its leaders relied on personal diplomacy and rapid reassurance to maintain equilibrium. The handling of the crisis reinforced the authority of Urho Kekkonen, whose ability to manage relations with Moscow was increasingly seen domestically as indispensable, even as it concentrated power in the presidency and narrowed the space for alternative foreign policy perspectives, a development that contributed to a political culture in which dissent was not prohibited, but discouraged by appeals to national interest and geopolitical realism. Internationally, Finland's response was interpreted as further evidence that neutrality could function within the Cold War system if it was credible and consistently maintained. Yet, Western observers continued to debate whether Finland's caution represented strategic prudence or a warning about the corrosive effects of proximity to Soviet power, a debate that intensified as détente reshaped East-West relations and raised questions about the future of neutral states in a less polarized environment. During this period, Finland leveraged its neutral status to play an increasingly active role in multilateral diplomacy, culminating in Helsinki's selection as the host city for the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, a process that began in the early 1970s and reflected Finland's ability to position itself as a bridge between blocs without abandoning its core principles. Hosting the negotiations that would eventually produce the Helsinki Final Act enhanced Finland's international visibility and reinforced the narrative that neutrality could contribute positively to European stability, even as it required careful management to ensure that participation did not slide into alignment or provoke suspicion. Domestically, however, the same period saw growing unease about the informal, constraints imposed by Finlandization, particularly among journalists, academics, and opposition politicians who questioned whether self-restraint had hardened into self-censorship and whether the fear of offending the Soviet Union had begun to distort public debate, concerns that were amplified by instances in which media outlets avoided coverage of sensitive topics or political actors moderated their language to remain within perceived limits. These debates did not translate into mass opposition to neutrality, which retained broad public support as a guarantor of peace and prosperity. But they highlighted the trade-offs inherent in a strategy that prioritized survival over expressive freedom. Economically, Finland continued to benefit from its dual orientation, deepening integration with Western Europe through trade agreements and industrial cooperation, while sustaining extensive bilateral exchanges with the Soviet Union that provided stable demand for Finnish exports, a balance that underpinned economic growth and social development and reinforced the domestic legitimacy of neutrality as a pragmatic choice rather than an ideological compromise. Militarily, Finland maintained a policy of credible defense, investing in territorial resilience and reservist training to signal that neutrality was backed by capacity rather than passivity, a posture that reassured domestic audiences and complicated any external calculus that assumed Finland could be coerced without cost. This emphasis on self-defense was carefully calibrated to avoid provoking suspicion, reflecting the constant balancing act between deterrence and reassurance that defined Finlandization in practice. As détente progressed in the 1970s, Finland's strategy appeared increasingly validated, as the reduction of superpower tensions widened the space for neutral actors and diminished the immediacy of security threats along Europe's periphery. Yet this apparent validation masked the persistence of asymmetry, as Finland's room for maneuver remained contingent on Soviet tolerance rather than on formal guarantees. The Helsinki process itself illustrated this duality, enhancing Finland's prestige while simultaneously reinforcing the importance of careful signaling, as Finnish diplomats worked to ensure that their role as host was perceived as facilitative rather than partisan. Within Finland, the consolidation of neutrality as national doctrine fostered continuity and stability, but it also entrenched a political style characterized by consensus and caution, traits that reduced polarization but also limited contestation, shaping a democratic system that functioned effectively within boundaries set by external reality. The endurance of this system through successive crises and leadership transitions suggested that Finlandization was not merely a personal strategy tied to individual leaders, but an institutionalized approach embedded in political culture, law, and public expectation. By the mid-1970s, Finland had achieved a level of prosperity, social cohesion, and international respect that contrasted sharply with the fate of many other small states caught between superpowers, reinforcing the argument that neutrality, when pursued with discipline and consistency, could preserve autonomy even under adverse conditions. Yet this success did not eliminate the underlying tension between independence and accommodation, a tension that would resurface in later debates as the Cold War evolved and as new generations questioned the assumptions inherited from the immediate post-war period. Finlandization thus entered the latter half of the Cold War as a proven but contested strategy, one that had secured survival and stability, but at the cost of enduring ambiguity, revealing that neutrality under the Soviet shadow was neither a surrender nor a simple triumph, but an ongoing negotiation shaped by power, perception, and restraint. As the Cold War moved into its final decade, Finlandization confronted a changing international environment that tested whether a strategy forged under rigid bipolarity could adapt to gradual systemic transformation without losing its core logic, and the evolution of détente into a more fluid and uncertain phase required Finnish policymakers to recalibrate their signaling while preserving the appearance of continuity that had underpinned Soviet confidence in Finnish reliability. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought new pressures as leadership changes in Moscow, renewed East-West tensions, and debates over European security revived concerns about the durability of neutrality. Yet Finland's response remained anchored in the same principles of predictability, legalism, and restraint that had defined its Cold War posture from the outset. Domestically, the political system continued to operate within the consensus-oriented framework established under Urho Kekkonen. whose long tenure had fused personal authority with foreign policy continuity. And although his eventual departure in 1981 raised questions about whether Finlandization depended too heavily on individual leadership, the transition demonstrated that the strategy had been institutionalized sufficiently to survive leadership change without destabilizing relations with the Soviet Union. The succession underscored the extent to which neutrality had become embedded not only in treaties and doctrines, but in administrative practice, elite expectations, and public understanding of national interest, reducing the risk that shifts in domestic politics would be interpreted abroad as strategic realignment. Internationally, Finland continued to emphasize its role as a neutral facilitator, maintaining active participation in multilateral forums and reinforcing its reputation as a predictable interlocutor. Even as renewed tensions between the superpowers narrowed the margins for maneuver and revived debates in Western Europe about the limits of neutrality in an era of missile deployments and strategic modernization. Finland's careful avoidance of public alignment on contentious security issues during this period reflected an awareness that neutrality required not only balanced behavior, but also disciplined silence, a restraint that drew criticism from some Western observers, but was viewed domestically as a necessary component of risk management. Economically, Finland's dual orientation persisted, with trade patterns continuing to reflect integration with Western markets, alongside stable exchanges with the Soviet Union, providing a measure of insulation against geopolitical shocks and reinforcing the practical benefits of neutrality in terms of growth and welfare. This economic stability strengthened public support for the existing foreign policy line, even as intellectual debates about self-censorship and democratic constraint continued, illustrating how material outcomes could legitimize strategic compromise. Militarily, Finland maintained its emphasis on territorial defense and conscription, signaling continuity in its commitment to self-reliance and reinforcing the credibility of neutrality by demonstrating that the country was neither dependent on external guarantees nor indifferent to its own security, a posture that remained carefully calibrated to avoid provoking suspicion while deterring opportunism. The persistence of this defense policy through changing international conditions highlighted the depth of strategic learning derived from Finland's wartime experience and early Cold War adaptation. As the 1980s progressed and signs of systemic change began to emerge within the Soviet Union, Finland's leadership faced the challenge of interpreting signals without overreacting, recognizing that premature adjustment could be as destabilizing as inertia. And this caution guided Helsinki's response to reforms and rhetorical shifts emanating from Moscow, which were met with measured engagement rather than public enthusiasm. The eventual easing of East-West confrontation did not immediately alter Finland's posture, reflecting an understanding that neutrality derived its credibility from consistency over time, rather than from responsiveness to transient developments. As the Cold War approached its conclusion, Finlandization appeared less as an imposed constraint than as a deeply ingrained national strategy, one that had allowed Finland to preserve sovereignty, democracy, and prosperity under conditions that might have overwhelmed less disciplined states, even as it continued to generate debate about the appropriate balance between accommodation and autonomy. In retrospect, the late Cold War phase demonstrated that Finlandization was neither a static formula nor a temporary expedient, but an adaptive framework capable of absorbing change while maintaining its core objective of survival under asymmetry. The endurance of this framework through leadership, transitions, economic shifts, and renewed geopolitical tension suggested that neutrality, when pursued as a strategic choice rather than an ideological stance, could function as a resilient mode of statecraft. Yet this endurance also underscored the costs inherent in such a strategy, as the habits of restraint and caution cultivated over decades shaped political culture and discourse in ways that would require reassessment once the external constraints that justified them began to recede. Finlandization thus entered the final years of the Cold War as both a proven success and an unresolved question, demonstrating how a small state could navigate the Soviet shadow through discipline and adaptation, while leaving open the debate over how such a strategy should evolve once that shadow began to lift. As the Cold War began to dissolve in the late 1980s, Finlandization confronted its most profound test, not from external coercion, but from the gradual erosion of the geopolitical conditions that had made disciplined neutrality both necessary and viable, and as reforms within the Soviet Union reduced the immediacy of the security threat that had shaped Finnish policy for 4 decades. Finnish leaders faced the challenge of redefining neutrality without destabilizing the carefully constructed equilibrium that had preserved sovereignty under asymmetry. The easing of East-West confrontation diminished the urgency of constant reassurance and exposed the degree to which Finland's political culture had been shaped by habits of restraint, consensus, and anticipation of external reaction. Habits that had ensured survival, but now raised questions about their continued relevance in a changing international environment. Domestically, debates that had long been muted gained greater visibility as journalists, academics, and political figures revisited the informal limits imposed on public discourse and assessed whether self-restraint had outlived its strategic purpose, a reassessment made possible by the perception that Soviet tolerance was no longer contingent on rigid behavioral conformity. Internationally, Finland moved cautiously to recalibrate its posture, signaling openness to deeper integration with Western Europe while maintaining continuity in its formal commitments, a strategy designed to avoid abrupt shifts that could be misinterpreted during a period of uncertainty and transition. This recalibration was incremental rather than declarative, reflecting the accumulated experience of managing asymmetry through gradualism and the belief that credibility rested on predictability even as circumstances evolved. The end of the Cold War did not produce an immediate repudiation of Finlandization, but rather a process of reinterpretation, as neutrality was reframed less as a constraint imposed by Soviet proximity and more as a foundation from which Finland could engage more fully with a transforming Europe. The legacy of Finlandization thus became a subject of historical and political reflection, as its successes in preserving independence, democracy, and prosperity were weighed against the democratic costs of prolonged self-censorship and constrained debate. Analytically, Finland's experience illustrated how strategies forged under extreme pressure could become embedded in national identity and institutional practice, persisting beyond the conditions that produced them and shaping responses to new opportunities and risks. The gradual lifting of the Soviet shadow did not erase the imprint of 4 decades of adaptation, but it allowed Finland to reassess the balance between caution and autonomy from a position of security rather than vulnerability. In this sense, the conclusion of the Cold War transformed Finlandization from a living strategy into a historical reference point, offering lessons about small state survival, the management of asymmetry, and the trade-offs inherent in neutrality within a polarized system. These lessons resonated beyond Finland, informing broader debates about the agency of small states and the conditions under which restraint can function as power rather than weakness. As Finland navigated the transition into the post-Cold War order, the disciplined neutrality that had defined its Cold War trajectory was neither discarded nor celebrated uncritically, but integrated into a renewed understanding of national interest, shaped by experience rather than ideology. The durability of Finland's democratic institutions and economic vitality at the end of the Cold War testified to the effectiveness of its strategy, even as the easing of external constraints opened space for a more open political culture and a reassessment of the limits that had once been accepted as necessary. Finlandization thus stands as a complex legacy, demonstrating that neutrality, when pursued as a strategic choice, grounded in realism and consistency, can preserve autonomy under severe constraint, while also reminding observers that such strategies carry long-term costs that must be confronted once the balance of power shifts. In the final analysis, Finland's survival under the Soviet shadow was not the result of weakness or submission, but of sustained strategic discipline applied over decades, a discipline that allowed a small state to navigate the Cold War without surrendering its core institutions, and that offers enduring insights into the possibilities and limits of neutrality as statecraft in an unequal world. In its final historical balance, Finlandization stands as one of the most disciplined and consequential survival strategies employed by a small state during the Cold War, not because it offered ideological inspiration or moral clarity, but because it demonstrated how autonomy could be preserved through restraint, continuity, and a clear-eyed acceptance of asymmetry. And as the Cold War ended, Finland's experience revealed that neutrality, when practiced as strategy rather than posture, could function as an active form of statecraft rather than a passive condition imposed from outside. Finland did not escape the Soviet shadow by denying its existence, nor by confronting it directly, but by structuring its political behavior, legal commitments, and public discourse around the management of risk, transforming vulnerability into predictability and predictability into space for independent action. This approach preserved Finland's democratic institutions, market economy, and national sovereignty at a time when many states along the Soviet periphery lost one or more of these elements, underscoring that outcomes during the Cold War were not predetermined by geography alone, but shaped by leadership choices, institutional discipline, and historical memory. The costs of this strategy were real and enduring, as habits of self-restraint narrowed public debate, concentrated authority, and embedded caution into political culture, effects that required deliberate reassessment once the external constraints that justified them began to recede. Yet these costs must be weighed against the alternative trajectories visible elsewhere in Europe, where the absence of such discipline led to subordination or collapse. Analytically, Finlandization challenges simplistic dichotomies between resistance and submission, revealing a spectrum of behavior in which accommodation can coexist with autonomy when guided by consistent principles and credible self-defense, and where neutrality can serve not as abdication, but as a means of preserving choice under constraint. The Cold War system, often portrayed as rigid and deterministic, allowed for such outcomes precisely because it was mediated by perception and signaling as much as by force. And Finland's leaders exploited this reality by maintaining clarity of intent, avoiding provocation, and anchoring their policy in legal frameworks that limited escalation while preserving room for maneuver. As the bipolar order dissolved, Finland emerged not as a relic of compromise, but as a functioning democracy prepared to adapt to a transformed Europe. Its long experience of restraint, providing a foundation for integration, rather than an obstacle to it. The endurance of Finnish sovereignty at the Cold War's conclusion thus affirms that survival under pressure need not entail surrender, and that weakness and prudence are not synonymous when power is unequal. Finlandization, in its full historical context, should therefore be understood not as a warning about capitulation, but as a case study in strategic realism, illustrating how small states can navigate hostile environments through disciplined neutrality, institutional coherence, and an unwavering focus on long-term survival rather than short-term assertion. In the final analysis, Finland survived the Cold War not by escaping the Soviet shadow, but by learning how to live within it without being consumed, a lesson forged through decades of calculated restraint that reshaped the meaning of neutrality from avoidance into strategy, and left behind a legacy that continues to inform debates about autonomy, power, and survival in an unequal international system.